So, a few weeks ago, I somehow managed to get my hands on a pre-release copy of Civilization 7. Through whatever eldritch means, a Firaxis representative found my channel and was kind enough to provide me access to the full game before release. I'm beginning the video like this because I want to make it clear that, while I was provided a Steam key, in no way is this video sponsored by Firaxis. This is also not a review, but a first impressions video, so I will not be giving a final score. I am incredibly grateful for the opportunity, but I intend to be as unbiased as possible for this video, while being as honest and transparent as I can be without breaking the NDA I signed. Without further ado, I am someone that used to play Civ 6 religiously, had my initial Civ addiction started by Civ 4, and dabbled a little bit with Civ 5. When Civ 7 was first released, I was highly skeptical because I did not like the idea of culture swapping, having had mediocre experiences with Humankind, a game that uses a very similar mechanic.
Oh, not good.
Furthermore, I had a lot of reservations about new features like crises and the reintroduction of the happiness system from Civ 5. After playing several playthroughs, I want to talk as in-depth as I am allowed to about the antiquity and exploration portions of the game, and pick apart what works, what doesn't, and give you, the viewer, a glimpse of Civ 7 beyond dev livestreams and promotional screenshots. With the introductory yapping out of the way, let's look at where most Civs begin, at the new game screen. When first starting out, you have the option to select a culture and leader to play as, which is a first in Civ history outside of a non-default option in Civ 4. And just like most other Civ games, you'll begin with a settler unit that is placed on a hexagonal grid map. I hate to immediately start with criticism, but the reason I'm beginning my review here is because my first impressions of the game were slightly negative. The founder unit that you start out with has very limited vision, movement, and doesn't really give you a great reading of your start. Because you don't begin the game with a scout, this is especially painful if you're playing a start-dependent Civ like Egypt, who relies on navigable rivers, a newly introduced terrain feature. I briefly mentioned the new game menu because I also found its implementation puzzling. Not only are there virtually zero options for map customization outside of size, but even the presets were lacking in my view. You have a few options like Fractal, Shuffle, Continents, Continents Plus, Archipelago, and Terra Incognita, but that's as far as it goes for player customization. What's more difficult is that I could not find any hint of a restart button in my several minutes of searching and consulting the handout guide, and this was a feature that made my restartitis in Civ 6 slightly more tolerable. Aside from the preset options, you cannot control humidity, continent size, or any other hyper-specific customization options that Civ 6 had, which may disappoint some players. What I am happy to report is that, after founding my city and spending a few turns looking at the game world, the map is definitely in the best shape it has ever been in. I've dealt with Rise and Fall's oversaturated retina bomb of a golden age, Civ 5's more realistic and earth tone color palette, and much more in my years of time with the franchise. However, I really enjoy looking at the game and the terrain features that feel much more alive than ever before. Everything, from basic, flat desert to tundra tiles, have been given serious consideration and have impressive color variety. I was particularly stricken by several of the mountain tile sets, like Tundra, which show off beautiful golden and gray hues that seamlessly blend into a breathtaking background. Ironically, I wasn't nearly as impressed with some of the wonder design. Sure, there are standouts like the Grand Canyon, but quite a few of them feel just okay. Additions like the Great Barrier Reef stand out on the map, but they also don't come across as particularly mesmerizing or captivating. What I'm trying to say is that they lacked some visual oomph in some departments. The size of the wonders also made me realize that there wasn't enough elevation variation in the map for my liking, but maybe I'm being overly picky. The map settings that allowed me to make the most of my experience were fractal and small. Normally, I don't really play on small maps, but tragically, Civ 7's largest map size doesn't go much above standard. This revelation angered some players in the past upon its reveal, but I didn't find player numbers to be as big of an issue as I originally thought they would be. The visuals feel like the best and worst of Civ 4, 5, and 6 at times. I say worst because an issue I had with the map visuals was how hard luxury and bonus resources were to pick out. Their tile sets are fine as is, but their actual icons are comically small, and the simplistic art reminded me more of Civ 4's resources, which isn't a compliment. Snark aside, some of these icons were so small that I missed them when it came time to place down buildings, and missed out on some early game adjacency bonuses. Navigable rivers were a huge request by many long-standing Civ fans in places like Civ fanatics, and Firaxis has delivered, I am happy to report. I was generally impressed with their implementation, and you can do things like building bridges across them, using them as a growth tile, and much more. Fortunately or unfortunately, these rivers are also very prone to flooding. This is because natural disasters return from Gathering Storm, and they make their presence known. When navigable rivers flood, depending on the disaster intensity, they also flood adjacent minor rivers too. Much to my chagrin, I found my entire city on an Egypt playthrough constantly flooded and destroyed. It was funny the first few times, granted, but soon I was practically hitting the repair tile button every turn, praying that the rain gods would end my suffering. Other forms of nature, like sandstorms, volcanic eruptions, and twisters, also returned to Civ 7. In my experience, I didn't find these disasters as consistently devastating as some of the river floods, but your mileage may vary. The actual graphics of the disasters can be pretty at times, albeit devastating. After I was done taking in the sheer majesty of the map, drool flowing from my foul maw like some dumbstruck tortoise, I encountered my first Civ. One of the largest overhauls to Civ 7 comes in the form of diplomacy. No longer are your options limited to a handful of yield-based alliances and the denounce and declare war buttons. Now, diplomacy is broken up into endeavors, sanctions, and treaties. The resource behind these interactions is influence, which acts like a currency that you can trade in through the diplomacy screen. Influence is generated passively, but can be boosted through certain buildings in civics. However, I found that it wasn't as freely handed out as something like food, so I was conscious of my usage. When you meet a Civ for the first time, you get a brief overlay on top of the map showing both of your leaders. You can choose from 3 different options to decide how you want to start your relationship. The neutral greeting, with no effect, doesn't cost any influence. However, if you want to start off as friendly or hostile, you can spend 20 influence, which isn't breaking the bank. Hostile greetings will immediately harm your relationship by 20 points, and friendly greetings can exchange the location of your respective capitals to the other player, and increase relations. You now start with your borders automatically closed, and you can use a treaty to open them to the other player. This is particularly useful for exploration, like if you want to reveal the location of a city for your merchant to travel to. Endeavors are a more involved, friendly exchange between the two parties, and the civs I met almost always wanted to start off on the right foot, which probably is in part due to the power of these contracts. It costs influence to suggest things like sanctions, treaties, and endeavors, but when both parties agree to support something like a cultural exchange for 60 influence, I found my civic research speed to be greatly boosted in the early game, and I went out of my way to meet new civs and become friendly with them. I would describe the overall attitude of the AI as sharply different from my past experiences with other games in the franchise. Typically, the AI is very aggressive and almost psychotic on difficulties like Deity, but when I played a few games at a higher difficulty, a lot of my neighbors were still very friendly, and went out of their way to court my friendship. Maybe I was just lucky, but I was quite taken aback by how friendly and outgoing the AI was in general. The one exception to this is leaders with the militaristic attribute. Leader traits have been reincarnated from Civ 4, and they give the AI and the new attribute system more nuance. Leaders with traits like scientific may prioritize science-producing quarters like observatories, while militaristic leaders will, in my experience, go to war more often. Unfortunately, I found this out the hard way in a few of my earlier playthroughs where I fucked around and found out. However, if you are able to befriend the AI early, they will absolutely go up to bat for you when it comes time for war. Once you increase their attitude up to helpful, you can form alliances which will call them into war with you. I noticed how much more proactive my neighbors were in coming to defend me and propose new endeavors when their timer expired, and it really impressed me. You can also use sanctions to your advantage, which act as a pseudo-espionage system in Civ 7. They can be costly, but rewarding if you are falling behind and need to steal technologies or slow down a player that is snowballing out of control. Independent powers are the other foreign power you'll interact with, and they replace the city-states of prior games. All independent powers start out as small settlements, which grow over time to become proper city-states. They will also start out as friendly, neutral, or hostile. The hostile powers act akin to barbarians in Civ 6, but I will warn you that they can be very overwhelming since they make use of the new commander system and will punish you if you lower your guard. If you do decide to take them out, their enclaves can be dispersed with a military unit. These powers are also based off of real tribes and groups from world history, and they have unique attributes tied to each of them. By befriending independents, you eventually make them a city-state. Once they become a city-state, you are their suzerain and can receive unique bonuses from them. For example, I became the suzerain of an Indian city-state and unlocked the unique stepwell improvement, which helped with my navigable river starts. The other, more violent Diplo option is to incite a raid, which can be useful if you are in the middle of a war with another civ. I'm a pretty big fan of these changes because I enjoyed the Barbarian Clans mode in the new Frontier Pass for Civ 6, and a lot of these features seem like one-to-one reimplementations of the mechanics introduced there. The suzerain is also immediately dragged into war if war has been declared on a city-state, so a lot of Civ 6 players may appreciate that. The diplomacy system was one of the new overhauls for Civ 7 that I had very little to complain about. I walked away with a very positive impression and feeling for it, and my only serious complaint was that independent powers had little in options for diplomacy. City-states on your home continent also disappear after the Antiquity Age, but I'll get into that later. Cities have been rather consistent across the franchise in my opinion, but Civ 7 has a serious reimagining of how they play out. In Civ 7, you create your first city with a founder unit, but when you go on to train settlers, they instead establish a town that can later be upgraded via gold to a city. The gold cost scales with things like civics and population size, but I found myself appreciating the system far more than what happened with Civ 6's system. Basically, a lot of the micromanaging traditionally associated with cities in past games has been shifted away from the traditional model. In layman's terms, even though I had a relatively large empire with several settlements and a few cities, the only serious planning that I was doing involved my cities. In previous installments, once you settled a city, you had to see it through to the end of the game. Settlements provide this transitory window where you can decide if that town is just going to exist to collect a certain luxury or resource you've been missing out on, or if it has some serious potential to be a thriving part of your empire. Take Jadet, one of my coastal settlements I created as Egypt. Normally, I would have to settle a city in a less desirable part of my empire in order to prevent the AI from forward settling me, but by keeping it as a settlement, I can extract valuable resources without having to worry about city planning or micromanagement. Settlements like Jadet don't use a production queue either. Instead, they convert production to gold, so you are rewarded in most cases for further investing in these towns without upgrading them to city status. And in the event that you do decide to upgrade said town, it likely already has some pre-existing infrastructure. Since these settlements don't use production, you have to buy improvements which culture bomb adjacent tiles. They also still grow like normal cities, and settlements can acquire a significant amount of land since pop growth also culture bombs adjacent tiles. Expanding rapidly this way can be a lot of fun, and you can reap the rewards of having a relatively wide playstyle without all of your time spent staring at the production queue. Also, yes, the production queue does make a return at launch thankfully, so you won't have to wait years for it to be patched in. Wink wink. There has been a hanging chad that's generated a lot of discussion, and that is the settlement cap. This, like all things holy, is raised by researching the civic tree and traditions. I never found it to be a hard ceiling per se, because you can expand over it, but the game was pretty generous with the amount of towns it let me have, so I was okay with it. If you do go over this cap, you can face some happiness penalties which affect yields, but this ended up being more of a deterrent for the AI than myself. Cities, meanwhile, are a much more complex beast. They are probably the most complicated they have ever been in Civ history, and for good reason. This is due to tiles now having 2 separate slots for improvements instead of 1. The devs throw around this new term of constructibles a lot, but I'm just going to keep it classic with terms like buildings and improvements. When you add 2 buildings to a tile, you create a quarter. Because of the myriad of different adjacency bonuses that these buildings have, you can get super involved with city planning, which I imagine will please a lot of the players that like the district shenanigans that Civ 6 introduced. The caveat to this is the lack of map tags or pins. I was kind of blindsided by this because I was clicking at the lenses tab aimlessly, praying to God that some sort of map tack icon would pop out and save me. Alas, I did a lot of digging and could not find any pins, tacks, or whatever that I could place down on the map and mark buildings. I imagine that this will be introduced later, but it was disappointing, nevertheless. But the art team has knocked it out of the park again for city assets, and seeing the sprawl of your full cities cover large sections of the map feels very rewarding, much more so than Civ 6. I did like the past game's district system, but they were too spread out and the cities felt a lot more like glorified suburbs at times. And I also see this as a big building block for where we are now. We've had unique districts and buildings before, but there is an insane amount of unique art for each and every building that you place down. A Mayan and Greek altar will look completely different. No 2 civs have the exact same art style when you factor in new, unique quarters that have been introduced into the game. The one exception to this rule are the palaces, which kind of confuses me because we had unique palaces in Civ 6. It's a small price to pay for the beautiful cityscapes we have now, but I'd like to see this changed in the future. I was really impressed by unique quarters, which can be created by placing 2 of your civ's unique buildings together on the same tile. For example, as Egypt, I created a necropolis by combining the mastaba and mortuary house buildings. The visuals aren't just impressive, but you are consistently rewarded since unique quarters have their own set of bonuses separate from unique buildings. It's all the more disappointing then that not every culture has access to a unique quarter. Some cultures only have 1 building, which makes this impossible to achieve. You would think that civs like the Kume and the Mississippians would have stronger bonuses to compensate, but I never found this to be the case. Their uniques can be underwhelming if you had a bad start, and the loss of a unique quarter takes a lot of the visual impact away from the city in my opinion. What's even more tragic is that the addition of culture swapping did not bring any unique cross-cultural quarters. I know that this would take an incredible amount of work to implement from the dev team, but it feels like another missed opportunity where player patience could be rewarded. For me personally, the most frustrating aspect about unique buildings was not having map pins available, and then accidentally placing one down, picking a later civ that would have really benefited from one of the tiles I developed, and then missing out on the adjacency bonuses. This doesn't happen too frequently, but I always feel like an idiot when it does, and it can be frustrating because it is such a stupid mistake to make. On one occasion, I was playing as Egypt and had to restart several times to get a decent navigable river next to my capital. Not sure of what culture I wanted to play next, I foolishly put down a mortuary temple next to one of my navigable rivers, forgetting that the Chola were a great option for my location. Once I decided to go with the Chola, I soon realized that I missed out on a perfect spot for one of my unique buildings, which could only be built on coastal tiles. Because you can't access autosaves from a previous age, I was stuck with my decision to play as the Chola, and that was that. I did have a few remaining coastal tiles, but this experience is far more common than you would think. Because of how quickly cities grow, you only have so much space to place down buildings before you run out. The addition of 2 slots per tile helps, but remembering where you want certain buildings to go to maximize city yields quickly becomes a chore, and, at times, it can feel like a slog where I go through the motions. This becomes further exacerbated with leaders and cultures that focus on gold and production. Because one of the best uses for gold in the game is to buy buildings, high-revenue civs like the Axomites can make the gameplay loop very boring. Eventually, you run out of building options, and you're stuck waiting to research the next tech. Special research projects that convert production into culture or science can temporarily resolve this issue, but it feels like a very boring filler option at times, and I never did this unless I needed to. I found it puzzling that the developers did not include the option to purchase tiles or chop out bonus resources. In past games, builders would happily remove resources on top of suitable locations for something like a wonder. In Civ 7, you're flat out of luck because builders have been removed from the game. I think this is one of the most glaring cases where something akin to chopping is needed, because expansion is now confined to culture bombing as a way to expand your city's borders. Wonders make a very interesting return to the franchise, because they are directly tied to cultures now. Each culture is affiliated with a specific wonder, and to incentivize players to build them, said culture gets a 30% production bonus towards building that wonder. Wonders are also one of the few buildings that grant universal adjacency bonuses, so you're encouraged to plop them down in the middle of your city and reap the rewards. But cultures don't just get a production discount for their wonder. The Greeks, for instance, get additional culture yields from the Oracle once they unlock the related traditions for it. To help ensure that you are able to build the wonder in time, cultures can unlock their affiliated wonders earlier by beelining the related tradition. I highly recommend this because you miss out on an incredible amount of content if you don't build your wonder early, and it can feel very punishing to have it sniped by another civ. Instead of immediately getting access to your civ abilities, you now gradually unlock them as the game progresses. Aside from wonder bonuses, traditions are new additions to the civic tree that grant unique bonuses. They often empower a civ's playstyle and add far more variety to the game compared to past installments. One of the Mayan traditions, Reigns of Chalk, grants +1 science to altars for each vegetated tile. This synergizes well with their forest start bias and the plus 0.5 science to palaces that they get at the start of the game. I found myself enjoying cultures like the Maya the most, because they didn't have a hyper-specific start bias, but they still had a distinct identity. Traditions further helped to develop this identity in my games, and I could still feel the impact of the traditions long after I ascended to the exploration age. Since these can become very complex after you factor in 3 separate cultures, there is a tradition tree that you can view for your empire. This helped me realize some of my priorities, but it can be a lot to juggle at times. Despite this, I can't help but think that traditions justify staying as your culture. There is a lot of fun to be had in culture swapping, but players would also likely get a lot of mileage with the option to remain as your antiquity culture, and get new traditions as the ages progress. But this brings us back to the eternal debate of culture swapping, so I want to clarify my stance. Before putting several days into Civ 7, I was quite critical of this mechanic because I had played Humankind, another 4X game with a very similar mechanic, and was left unimpressed. With Humankind, I found my nation to be less of a melting pot and more of a landfill of different cultures. At the end of the game, my empire was completely unrecognizable from where I started off. In order to tackle this issue, the devs decided to cut down the game to 3 ages. This does several things, but for pacing, it ensures that you aren't swapping so frequently that it disrupts the flow of the game and makes your empire unrecognizable, problems that Humankind frequently ran into. Now, ironically, the biggest issue I have with this feature is something that I talked about very little. Cultures are locked behind certain requirements. If I want to play as the Majapahit, I have to establish several coastal trade routes in the Antiquity. If I want to forward settle as the Normans, I need to improve 3 iron tiles. These restrictions often feel arbitrary, and I think they need to go in order to improve the gameplay experience. If I have the perfect start for the Chola, but I couldn't settle one more coastal city, I'm out of luck. There's really no other recourse for this other than to mod it out for the time being, and this feels like another instance of the devs trying to be vaguely historically accurate at the cost of fun and engagement. The only caveat to this is that by playing as a certain leader or culture, you can unlock civs in the next stage without needing to fulfill those pesky prerequisites. But if you play as an older leader, like Augustus, you probably won't get any additional cultures to unlock, which is very disappointing. Events known as crises will pop up on the transition to the next age. These serve as a transition period, and the overall narrative is that your empire, for whatever reason, is on the decline and you need to fortify against the forces of evil. In this case, it's the plague or barbarians for the Antiquity Age. You won't get barbarians and plagues on the same save though. It's one crisis type per age, and the intention behind this system was to reduce player fatigue and increase retention. Oftentimes, in any strategy game, the player finds themselves snowballing past the point of no return. The crisis is powerful enough to set you back or knock you down a few pegs, but I never found it overwhelming to the point where I felt like I lost the game. Before the crisis starts, you'll get event pop-up windows notifying you of the crisis type via flavor text. The barbarians were more interesting to me because they present a direct intangible threat. Like independent powers, they start popping up with encampments near cities and settlements. They will repeatedly try to raid and pillage your empire and cannot be negotiated with under any circumstances. After all, we do not negotiate with terrorists. But this disappointed me, because I feel like there is a lot of opportunity here. While still remaining a threat, there should be the option for weaker players to pay tribute, or even offer a city to these raiders if they feel overwhelmed. I don't think the devs wanted to make the crisis a pushover, so they eliminated the potential scenario of players stockpiling influence and easily resolving it. It's a shame that something like emergencies don't really return to Civ 7, because they allowed players to cooperate and work towards a common goal for diplomatic rewards. I still found myself working together with past enemies to take out this threat though. In a lot of my games, I quickly ended wars and worked together with the AI to take out the encampments, and it's just a shame that there isn't any further infrastructure or depth for this relationship, because I'd like to see it explored more by the devs. Plagues are rather disappointing to me. They don't have any encampments pop up, but randomly pick cities to become infected. Once a city is infected, several tiles are pillaged and you can only repair them once the plague leaves. On top of this, your cities become coated in a sickly green miasma, and start generating unrest as soon as the plague spreads. I didn't find this too engaging, and the mechanic was more of an annoyance than a serious threat. There weren't any opportunities to work with my neighbors, and the flavor text loved to talk about healing houses, but I didn't see any unique improvements that would let me reduce spread rate or become more involved in stopping the crisis. The biggest offender in my mind isn't the crises themselves. Instead, I really disliked the forced policy cards that you had to take as the crisis intensified. These weren't all negative and had some trade-offs, but they reminded me more of the Dark Age policy cards we had in Civ 6, which I also found to be hit or miss. I think forcing these debuffs on the player with the narrative that their empire is collapsing will frustrate a lot of players. The crisis comes regardless of how well you performed. No amount of tomfoolery will stop you from having to slot in these crisis policies, and if they don't mesh well with your empire, then too bad. As a whole, I appreciate the reworks that the policy system has had since the last game. Policy cards are no longer split up into categories, and you gradually expand the amount of slots you have as you have more celebrations. By having a high amount of happiness, therefore more celebrations, you can snag up a lot of space for additional policies that you will come across via civics research. Upon founding a government, you are given the choice to choose a bonus when you have a new celebration. There are several options, and they come in pairs of 2. In the Exploration Age, I may choose a government type that grants me 20% culture for 10 turns, or reduced production costs for civilian units. This feels pretty straightforward, and that's because it is. Governments feel like they've lost complexity in exchange for simplicity. I don't know how much I like this change, but it slots in with the happiness mechanic consistently. What I do like are the new Civ-specific policy cards. Certain traditions will give you access to unique policies, like Riches of the Dust for Egypt. This grants a 15% production bonus towards wonder construction, and you can retain these policy cards after transitioning to a new age. What I don't like is that all of the celebrations that you previously had become irrelevant, since your policy slots are reset upon reaching a new age. Happiness is a returning mechanic that ties into how cities develop. There are a few sources of happiness, such as growing certain tiles and wonders, but your main source is likely going to be policy cards or luxuries. Important to note that not all luxuries are dedicated to happiness. A lot of them, like ivory, will raise yields such as food and production. Incense grants 10% bonuses to science, and silk grants 10% bonuses to culture. Additionally, bonus and luxury resources may have different effects depending on a city's location. If you assign a good like gypsum to your home continent, its effect may be lessened than if it were assigned to a colony in the New World. By assigning different resources to cities, you play this mini-game of balancing happiness with economic output, like some cyberpunk dystopia. Merchants are a trainable unit that work by establishing trade routes to cities. Because you are always going to want luxuries, having friendly relationships with at least one of your neighbors is very important. Luxury distribution can be very random, and certain luxuries are locked behind the new world, like cocoa. So if you can't acquire a luxury with a useful bonus, then you might want to kiss up to an empire that has it. Once you've worked a luxury tile or set up a trade route, you have copies that you can assign to cities. When you don't prioritize luxuries or go over the settlement limit, then prepare for issues with unrest. Unrest is generated slowly over time and gradually reduces city or settlement output. I found that my most successful cities maintain just enough happiness to succeed. Specialists further complicate this, since they reduce your happiness at the cost of improving yields like science and culture. Instead of growing and culture bombing your tiles like rural growth does, urban tiles can be assigned pops that grant yields based on the buildings present. There are a lot of unique interactions with specialists that'll let you find out for yourself, but I enjoyed the nuance. I tried to put as many related buildings together, which made parts of my city have a more distinct feel to it than otherwise. When I finally moved on to the exploration age, I found specialists to become core to gameplay, but I had mixed feelings on the overbuilding mechanic. Many buildings in Civ 7 are tied to their respective ages, and some, like granaries, are truly ageless, but improvements, like the inn, can be built over in the following age. This concept is known as overbuilding. In a nutshell, overbuilding is basically redeveloping your city to a more modern standard. As technology develops, you need to refit and reapply new building techniques and planning to outdated districts. In concept, I really like this idea, but I also hated to rip out my historic quarters and slot in newer buildings. I think if this was sold as a type of upgrade system, it would go down easier for me, but to see the architecture of your city suddenly change due to culture swapping is a bit jarring. Things like unique buildings and wonders remain, but this is an instance where unique palaces would have added more significance to the transition. I was really excited about getting to play the Exploration Age, because I loved playing Terra maps in Civ 6 and settling the new world. To ensure the AI actually colonizes, the game gives everyone new ships that are capable of exploring the open ocean. My first real hiccup with this concept came down to RNG though. On some starts, I could easily find a path to the new world and begin settling, but on others, I would get a sizable gap of open ocean that made founding settlements near impossible. This is because your ships will take damage for each turn they spend on a tile of open ocean. So when you factor in that you can only cross one tile of open ocean early on, things can get dicey. There tends to be a buffer zone of smaller islands to help you in this endeavor, but I still had my issues. I am happy to report that, once you get to new lands, the AI is very proactive about colonizing. New luxuries give you a serious reason to explore, but if you're trying to play tall, it's going to feel rather forced to start colonizing. In fact, players that like tall gameplay may be turned off by Civ 7. Because of how specialists work with happiness, there's going to be a significant handicap if you leave most of your lands open to settlement. The AI in this game is incredibly aggressive with founding cities, and I found them to be rather competitive. Now, I wouldn't say that they were a serious threat by any means, but more so than what I faced in other games. I really need to see some improvements made on the AI settling decisions because they can be egregious at times. After several games, I've become a big proponent of lowering the settlement cap, rather than abolishing it entirely. One of the perks of Rise and Fall was that it reined certain AI behavior in, like forward settling, but the absence of that mechanic is felt now more than ever. I frequently found myself having to raise and harass the AI in the Exploration Age as they expanded. A new way to do this is with fleet commanders, who become vital as time goes on. Treasure fleets are a new unit, and they are a key part of the economic victory. By amassing a fleet of various boats headed by an admiral, I quickly intercepted and profited off of the AI's soft spot. Naval gameplay has had a major glow-up and is the big bonus of having a new world in every game. Since you're bound to have a few colonies, making sure settlers can colonize in the first place is very important. In my hours with Civ 7, I was building a serious amount of naval power, and I never felt the need to step down. With all that said, the Exploration Age gameplay can feel too samey to the Antiquity. You're expanding externally instead of internally, but there could be more unique interactions to compensate for this. While there are 1 to 2 civs in the New World, they don't feel unique, and are more of an afterthought. The city-states that you spent time developing disappear at the end of the Antiquity Age, and they're now scattered across the New World. You have to start from scratch in many cases, and you are putting up with a lot of the same shenanigans that you dealt with in Antiquity. I find it odd for a game that leans on historical accuracy that the New World natives are at a similar technological level. It was weird to see independent powers with crossbows fighting my units who are at the same technological level, but I just want to see more meat here. Now, I can't talk too much about victory types because they are tied more to the modern age. However, there are various victory conditions that you can achieve in the Antiquity and Exploration Age. Funnily, I actually took more notice of the events, which can occasionally reward different attribute points to flesh out your skill trees, but aside from that, the victory types, again, were really at the background of my gameplay experience. That said, there was obviously a lot of time spent writing unique events and outcomes for civilizations and leaders, which I thought was really cool and interesting to engage with, and I think players will be excited if they were expecting more of an RP angle. But out of all of the systems that I reviewed, I thought that it would be courteous to Firaxis to save religion for last, since I absolutely hate it. In fact, there is no system I despise more. As soon as I reach the exploration age, I dread researching piety and building a temple. Once you do so, you begin the madness that is religion management. Religion in Civ 6 was annoying, but it was somewhat manageable thanks to Inquisitors. A lot of the core framework of religions are the same, such as enhancer beliefs, but gameplay has been shifted to focus on relics. Relics can be useful to your empire, so the beliefs are geared towards converting foreign lands in exchange for them. I dislike religion in Civ 7 for 3 core reasons. 1. You cannot really opt out of it, similar to New World colonization, since it is an important part of the game. 2. The AI builds and spams missionaries like there is no tomorrow, significantly increasing turn time in the exploration age of the game. And 3. The beliefs are tilted towards aggressively converting civs, but you cannot convert holy cities, so you will always be fighting with enemy missionaries. To top things off, there is no religious victory, so a lot of the time it feels like pointless busy work and detracts massively from my experience. Since cities are instantly convertible now, there are 2 separate tiles you need to convert to form a majority: rural and urban tiles. As you can guess, rural tiles are things like farms and mines, while urban tiles could be the palace, for instance. But if you don't research civics like Reformation, you start losing out on a 15% buff to culture and science yields to your cities following your religion. Since missionaries have 3 charges, this takes up a lot of time having to constantly train and send them out to fight back. I may sound dramatic, but if there is no option to turn this mechanic off on day 1, I'll be looking for a mod that removes it on the Steam Workshop. There really is no upside to religion in Civ 7, and it feels like it combines the worst aspects of religion from every game prior. Despite my grievances, I had a lot of fun playing Civ 7, and my overall impression is much more positive than it was going in. I think the key fundamentals like culture swapping and traditions work, with a few caveats like lack of map customization and performance drops sprinkled in. Even though there are 1 to 2 major hiccups, like religion, it did not detract from my experience so much to say that I had a bad time. I'm cautiously optimistic for Civ's future, and I'm really thankful that I was given the opportunity to play the game before release. This is a first impressions video that only covers the first 2 ages, but if the devs hammer out these issues before release, I look forward to coming back and fully reviewing the game when the time comes. Please let me know what you thought of this video, whether you're new to the channel or a recurring viewer, and what your thoughts are on Civ 7 so far. I'm always happy to engage and interact with your comments, so please feel free to leave a comment down below. I put a lot of time into this video, and it may be my longest one yet, so also leave a like if you enjoyed the first impressions, and I hope to see you guys later. Love you guys. Peace.